Hello, everybody, and welcome to Local History and Genealogy Live. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Friday morning. So before we get started, I would like to give you an update on some of the upcoming events, upcoming Facebook Lives that we have going on here in Local History and Genealogy. So in a couple weeks on August 21st, my colleague will be here to talk about our Faces and Places collection, which is our photograph collection. So everything from an alligator to beauty contestants, bygone buildings, and cats. You can find pictures of pretty much anything in our Faces and Places collection. So my colleague will join us and talk about some of her favorites. So that is definitely not one that you would want to miss. And then in September, on September 4th and September 18th, we will be talking about our historic Pike Street walking tour. So you might have joined us on this tour a couple years ago, and we're going to do it virtually. So first and third Fridays in September, September 4th and September 18th, join us and we'll take you on a virtual stroll down historic Pike Street and talk about some of our favorite stops. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter today. So instead of hearing me talk, we have a local author here, Jeff Suess. He will be here to discuss his new book, Cincinnati, an Illustrated Timeline. And he's going to share some stories and photographs and images from key moments in the region's history. So everything from the native mound builders to early Kentucky settlers, all the way to the new FC Cincinnati soccer team. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to him. And we'll get him on the screen here so you can see him. And please join me in welcoming local author, Jeff Suess.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me. Looks like I have the green light on. So yep, I am the librarian at the Cincinnati Enquirer, and I write about Cincinnati history at Cincinnati.com and in the Enquirer. And I have a few books out now about Cincinnati history, and this is my latest one here, Cincinnati Illustrated Timeline. Kind of the idea behind this was I wanted to show the entirety of the history of Cincinnati, where you can kind of see different connections. So it's kind of about 350 or so of the key moments in Cincinnati history. I kind of say from the mound builders to Fiona, and it's everything: sports, politics, crime, whatever, disasters, like the floods and things like that. And the real challenge there was to figure out, one, what are the key moments? And then also to find illustrations to go with it. And so luckily the Enquirer allowed me to use the archives. So there's a lot of the more recent photos from the last 50 years heavily come from the Enquirer. And then there's a lot of great historical images out there. In fact, Kent County Library has a great resource for local photos. So what I want to do is highlight some of the interesting moments in early Cincinnati history and the development with some of the photos of the book. And if you have any questions throughout, we have the little public question, like a chat. You put those in, and when we get towards the end, I will try to answer a few of those questions. So without further ado, I'm trying the technology. Okay, so in Cincinnati, before the city was settled, this area was the earliest people that we know that lived here. We don't even really have a name for them, but we called them the Adena culture. And they were mound builders, and they built these Indian mounds, as you see in this picture. This is a serpent mound in Adams County. And we know so little about them. They were basically doing carbon dating to figure out what era were these from, and there's been some conflicting data. So it's like they're either from this culture, the Adena culture, or they're from the Fort Ancient culture. And it's kind of like what we know about them is evolving as we find out more information. And they're named for the Adena people for there was a home called Adena in Ohio that was the first mounds that they found, and found or that they had uncovered and found some of the artifacts. And this is an Adena pipe here. So it's an actual smoking pipe that looks like a figurine of one of the people from that era. There were burial mounds throughout the Cincinnati area. In fact, downtown, there was one kind of between around 5th Street, where Fountain Square is, down to about 3rd Street. That when the city was first settled, the early historians like Daniel Drake actually recorded, yes, there was this mound here, but as the city developed, it was all kind of wiped out. So the most significant one or in this area is, of course, is the Serpent Mound. Then the other people, later people who came in were the Shawnee. And when the first, we don't really think about this as the West anymore. But when you had the original colonists come in, everything west of the Alleghenies was the Old West. And the Ohio area was really Shawnee territory at that time in the 1700s. Kentucky was really their hunting grounds. And so when you had the earliest white settlers come in, people like Daniel Boone, and they would come and set up Fort Boonesboro and those kind of areas. The Shawnee were using northern Kentucky for hunting, and so they had a lot of conflict because they thought, well, we should be able to still do these things. So Kentucky, of course, is essential to the development of this area. So they came up south through the Cumberland Gap and started settling. And you have those names that you've probably all heard, grown up with: Simon Kenton, Daniel Boone, George Rogers Clark. All of those folks were kind of interacting. And this is a picture here you see where it's a very dramatic illustration of Daniel Boone fighting against a Shawnee who had abducted Boone's daughter and 2 other women. And so as I grew up in California, and so it was kind of fascinating to think about some of these figures like Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton that you hear about that almost seem like legends. And you're like, no, these were real people that really did these, a lot of these actions that you read about in stories. One of the the first real biography of Daniel Boone was written by a guy named John Filson. And John Filson had land in Kentucky, and he was promoting some of the land he owned down there. And so he wrote a guide called, I think it was the Guide to Kentucky, something like that. And he had this appendix at the end of the book about the history of Daniel Boone. And that's what kind of started setting up the legend of Daniel Boone. But what's key about Filson in this area is Filson was one of the 3 men who purchased land from the Sims Purchase area that were the founders of Cincinnati. And I'm going to show that in the next slide here. So Cincinnati, and you have this big thing on here, it says Losantaville. That was the original name for Cincinnati. So the Sims Purchase, kind of step back, it was John Cleve Sims, purchased tons of acreage from the government after the end of the Revolutionary War, and then sold up all the parcels. And it is most of what is now Hamilton, Butler, and Warren County in Ohio. And he sold to 3 men, Filson, Patterson, and Matthias Denham. Sorry, got a million facts in my head. Always got to try to make sure. That's why I write these things down, right, to look at later. And they bought the land, and we're going to settle. And there were 3 settlements around the same time, within a month of each other, in this area. And the first was called Columbia, which is now the Columbia-Tusculum area east of Cincinnati. Second one was Losantaville, as we'll talk about. And the third was North Bend. And John Cleve Sims himself settled in North Bend, and that's where he thought was going to be the biggest and most important settlement. Instead, it was Losantaville. And so Filson, who was the one who wrote the Daniel Boone stuff, he was the surveyor, and he came up with a name for the place, called it Losantaville. And he took these syllables from different languages, and French and Greek and stuff, and it meant the city opposite the mouth of the Licking River. And of course, the Licking River was in Kentucky and very important because the earlier white European settlers were in Kentucky, and they were branching out. So no one had really moved on into Ohio yet. So that was the original name, Losantaville. You see in this picture, this is Cincinnati from about 1802. And there's a little tree in the front, Sycamore Street, and that is where in 1788 the first settlers brought their flatboats and they settled in Lusantaville, and that little inlet there is where they landed. They used the boats and they broke them down and used the wood to build houses and cut down trees. So it was a lot more forested area. And what made Cincinnati or Lusantaville at that time more successful than the other settlements is that it had that lip of land, so it didn't flood as much. And then, of course, you have the basin of the hills and stuff, so it was kind of more protected. So in when they wanted to have a fort to protect against, because now we're in Shawnee territory, and so there were a lot of conflict with the Shawnee people, and so they wanted to protect the settlers, so they had a fort, and they needed one centralized location, and they chose Lusantaville. And I have a picture here of that fort, Fort Washington, and that was built roughly kind of where Lytle Park is today, a little off from that, but around that area. And Fort Washington was the General St. Clair, who was the kind of the president of the Northwest Territory, because there's all this area, Ohio, Indiana, and stuff is all the Northwest Territory. He came to examine the fort, and he loved the fort. This is 1791, I'm off the top of my head. And he loved the fort, but he hated the name Lusantaville, and so he changed it to Cincinnati. And the Cincinnati name came from the Society of the Cincinnati, which was a kind of a military fraternal organization of officers from the Revolutionary War. And the name Cincinnati is for Cincinnatus, who was a Roman general in the 5th century BC, who had been a farmer, and he'd been called in to lead in battle, and they won, and they said, well, we want you to be emperor, and he said no, and he went back to being a farmer. And that was kind of the example that George Washington followed, with returning down, becoming king at the end of the war and going back to Mount Vernon. And so that's the name Cincinnati, Cincinnatus, was kind of evoking not only the Roman general, but George Washington. It's kind of that feel. So you have Fort Washington and Cincinnati, kind of a romanticized George Washington. So this Fort Washington kind of protected the area through the kind of the Indian Wars up until 1795, when they had the Treaty of Greenville that kind of had a momentary peace in this Ohio area. And there's so a lot of the expeditions and stuff that would go into those battles were coming from Fort Washington. Now, interestingly enough, we didn't know exactly where Fort Washington was. If we go back to the previous picture, you can see it's number 14 in the top corner there, but it's kind of a vague, and it wasn't until the 1950s that they got for sure a location when they were doing building a garage. I think it was Western Southern area, and they were in digging down there, they found a powder magazine. And they were able to identify, based off of the plans, where exactly the orientation was. And they had a marker downtown, and they had to move it a little bit because it turns out that they were off by a few hundred feet of where Fort Washington really was. And of course, Fort Washington Way is named for that original fort. In the early 1820s, teens and 20s, Cincinnati became a real river town with steamboats. The first steamboat came by in 1811. And there was a lot of steamboat manufacturing down in what they call the Fulton area, kind of Anderson Township, not quite there, but just east of the city. And this is what the riverfront looks like. This is actually about 1900 in this photo. So it's kind of clogged with lots and lots of steamboats. And this was what they called the public landing then. And it was real just dirt and gravel and stuff that you would come down and load up the boats. And the key for the steamboats was that, we got a lot of manufacturing, because this is what would take our area would allow goods and manufacturing stuff to be sent to Mississippi River and everything. So we were kind of a centralized location, and the river town. But we also did a lot of shipbuilding. So the river really was what built up Cincinnati. We kind of forget these days because Cincinnati is not one of the major cities anymore. But at one point in the 1850s and 60s, we were the 6th largest city in America. And it was the biggest on the West as before the expansion. You know, Chicago hadn't been built up or anything yet. And so the river was really what made that possible. And this is what we are most known for, was meat packing. We were the meat packing capital in the country, and so it was got a kind of a goofy nickname of Porkopolis. This is an illustration that's pretty graphic, actually. It's by Henry Farney, who was a famed illustrator artist. We did a lot of Native American depictions and things. He's from Cincinnati. And but this kind of shows the whole process, and it was a pretty gruesome sort of process. And there are a lot of writings at the time that, you know, Cincinnati was trying to get this reputation for culture and West. That's where the Queen City nickname comes from. But at the same time, we had this manufacturing and pork meat packing, and you know, there were literally pigs running through the streets going off the slaughterhouses, and you know, lots of blood and not so nice things. There was a woman named Frances Trollope from England, and she wrote about it, the smell and stuff like that. And you know, it was not necessarily a favorable commentary on Cincinnati, but it was probably a fairly accurate commentary. And so the byproduct of all of these things, though, is not just the meat packing, but you know, they would utilize all these different parts. You know, nothing went to waste at that time, and so you would use the lard from the pork packing to make things like soap and candles. And two big companies that kind of came out of this were, of course, Procter Gamble, and there was Emery, and so the Emery oleochemicals, which is still around. And Emery, of course, went on to Mary Emery was in the family, Jack Emery, and building of the Crew Tower and the Terrace Plaza Hotel. Mary Emery built the Emery Auditorium and Marymount and stuff. So, you know, a lot of money and stuff. And of course, Procter Gamble is still enormous. And all of that kind of came from that Porkopolis era of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 1850s. 1837 was when Procter and Gamble, one was a candle maker, one was a soap maker, and they got together and started up the company. So all of that is kind of the byproduct of Cincinnati being a river city, meat packing, and then the byproducts of that. Also, because of the proximity to slave territory, Cincinnati was very active in the Underground Railroad. The Ohio River was kind of like the River Jordan, where it was the separation of the Promised Land. And so, you know, with Kentucky having slavery legalized and not in Ohio, there was a lot of crossover there. This is a picture of Margaret Garner. It's a painting. And that story was Margaret Garner was her and her husband and kids were trying to escape from slavery, and they came over into Ohio. And when they were captured by kind of like fugitive slave hunters, Margaret Garner elected to kill one of her children instead of having them into slavery. And that was the basis of Beloved by Toni Morrison, and there's an opera, Cincinnati Opera did a few years ago. So that's still a story that really resonates in the racial things. We had abolitionists like Levi Coffin, who was one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad, if you don't know, was really not a railroad, but as kind of a system of safe houses where they would get people who were trying to escape from slavery, and they would go to a safe house and stay in the basement or things like that. And it was very, very dangerous for everyone involved. And there were a lot of, Coffin was one of the major ones. The Ripley in Ohio has got some homes like the Parker House and some of the others that were part of that station. That's why, of course, we have the Underground Railroad Freedom Center in this location. And then another one, important one, was Harriet Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she talked about the whole issue, and that it kind of changed a lot of people's minds of and kind of understanding more of the ills of slavery. She lived here in Cincinnati in the 1830s and 40s when her father was the president of Lane Seminary in Walnut Hills. And it was her experiences and seeing some of the racial riots and things in this area that inspired her to write Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 when it was published. Another interesting thing we don't hear too much about is during the Civil War, there was no real battles in Cincinnati area, but there was what they called the Siege of Cincinnati. And pardon me, I'm going to drink water. So during the Civil War, about 1862, there was a lot of the Confederates were going through cities and were being able to take over them without much resistance. And Cincinnati, even though it's in the north, and Kentucky was still in the Union, but even though Cincinnati was kind of a northern city, had a lot of southern business and enterprises and stuff, and were a little more the powers that be, if you will, were a little more sympathetic to not the Confederacy, but to sort of like, hey, let's just leave. If they want to leave, they want to leave. If they don't, it was not so much a they thought it would be easy to take over Cincinnati. Let's put it that way. And they were wrong, really. When the word came out that they were going to come to Cincinnati, martial law was declared in the city, and they, the guy named General Lew Wallace, who later went on to write the book Ben-Hur, that became the famous movie and everything, very huge book in that century. They took over with a martial law, but they needed to get across the river. And this is what we have. There was no Roebling Bridge yet. The project had started before the war, but it stopped because of the war. And so the engineers came up with the idea of taking these coal barges and tying them together and built a pontoon bridge in about 48 hours, which was unheard of, to be able to build a bridge. And they could get soldiers and everything to come across the Ohio River into Kentucky. Now, step back just a little bit. When this first started, they called on all the able-bodied men to help out. And the African-American folks basically had said at the beginning of the war, they had tried to volunteer to fight. And they were told, really on no uncertain terms, that this is not your war. And so when they called on everybody, they basically said, well, you don't mean us. Well, they did want them. And so they sent a lot of kind of like some cops and others with guns, and went to their homes and dragged them from their homes and kind of imprisoned them and forced them into helping. And there was a guy named Judge Dixon who thought this was appalling. So he went to General Wallace and complained, and Wallace sent everybody home and said, give everybody the dignity of volunteering. And so the next day, it was like twice as many African Americans enlisted or volunteered to serve and help out than had been forced. And so they set up their own thing called the Black Brigade. And the Black Brigade was sent over into Kentucky to build the fortifications. So, Fort Mitchell, Fort Thomas, all those things were kind of the fortifications to protect against the Confederates coming in. And the Confederates basically said, wow, I'm summarizing here, but they were a lot more prepared than we thought they were. This is not going to be easy. Our resources are better utilized elsewhere, and they left. The Black Brigade was, several of the soldiers went on to be in like the Massachusetts 54th, which is the famous one that was in like the movie Glory. And down in Smale Park a few years ago, they built this memorial to the Black Brigade. And so this is a Black Brigade soldier handing a ceremonial sword to Judge Dixon. And so there's a bunch of murals and things down there that tell the whole story of the Black Brigade. It's quite fascinating. I'm going to kind of hurry along here. A couple of extra stories. I mean, so much history in 250 years. Civil War connections with the Burnett House. This was at 3rd and Vine Street. And this was like one of the major first modern hotels. It was like about the third modern hotel in America. So it had tons of rooms, running water, and things like that. And all the important people stayed here, whether it's Jenny Lind, the opera singer, Oscar Wilde, Abraham Lincoln gave a couple of speeches here. And in the second floor parlor, right in the corner there, in 1864, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman met there in the parlor, and they put down maps and smoked cigars, and they figured out how to end the Civil War. And the plan basically for Grant to go after Lee in Richmond, and Sherman to go in the South and kind of disrupt things. When he got there, he kind of adapted it and made the March to the Sea. And so it was one of those stories that you hear about, but I actually went through some of the writings of the period and did find at one point Sherman came back shortly after the war, and they had a little celebration at the Burnett House, and he was quoted in the Inquirer as saying that right there in this parlor, Grant and I put down maps and figured out how to end the war. So that was a pretty big important. Another local guy who had a big impact, this guy is named Salmon P. Chase. He was the Secretary of the Treasury on Lincoln's cabinet. In Cincinnati, he had been a lawyer, politician, he had been on city council, been governor of Ohio, pretty much everything he could possibly be. His big aspirations were to be president, and so he was on that team of rivals of Lincoln's, and they butt heads a lot. His job in the Civil War was to pay for it, and so he set up the first paper currency in American history, which is called the greenbacks. And as any enterprising politician would do, he'd put his face on the bills. Those were replaced and stuff shortly after the war. During the war, though, he kept kind of quitting, and finally Lincoln accepted his resignation and nominated him for the Supreme Court, and he became the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. But he still wanted to be president, so he ran for president again while being Chief Justice. It's kind of crazy politics at the time. Because of his connections to the paper currency, he was placed on the $10,000 bill, as you all know, looking at the $10,000 bills you have at home. So now you know a little bit more about Salmon P. Chase. You get to the 1860s and 70s, is kind of like the shift over of the heyday of Cincinnati, and then it goes into what the Cincinnati that we know. I mean, most of the things that we think about, from the Reds to Procter Gamble to Music Hall and the bridge and all these things, all kind of came around in that same, about 10-year, 15-year gap. So you see the Roebling Bridge, there's the Island Queen going to Coney Island. In the other picture, you've got the original Fountain Square when it was in the middle of 5th Street. Mabley and Carew, the big department store that, Carew Tower and all this stuff is kind of named for. I'm kind of going to go through a bunch of quick history here. Music Hall, the Rookwood Pottery, which started here in 1880. Mariah Longworth started this world famous pottery company, which was really unheard of for a woman to be leading a company of that size at that time. And of course, it's still world renowned Rookwood Pottery here. The Reds, as I said, 1869, they were the first professional team. Their first stadiums were actually where Union Terminal is now, and then they kind of moved to kind of Bank Street, and then the Findlay and Western area for many years. Now, they weren't the first baseball team, but they were the first professional, meaning that they openly paid all of their players. And last year, they celebrated the big 150th anniversary. Inclines. So I don't know if any folks remember the Inclines. It's been quite a while since we've been here. But, I mentioned the city was in a basin, right? And you have all the hills. It was really hard for development to move outside of the hills. Because a omnibus pulled by horses couldn't pull it up the hill. Only wealthy people with their own carriages could afford to move up and set things up. So you get kind of Mount Auburn and some of those areas. And so in the 1870s, they used the incline ideas that came from Pittsburgh, has a couple of them, and they said, what a great idea. So they set up 5 different inclines. They had Mount Auburn, Mount Adams, Price Hill, Fairview. I'm missing one, but anyway, this is you get Hyde Park here on I guess that's the left, if you see it under the inclines. The other one is the Mount Auburn one going up. That's the original McMicken house where UC started. And so it was these, what they call a funicular. It's a system where the streetcar would go on a platform. One goes up, the other one goes down. That allowed for people to move outside of the basin and spread out. And so suburbs started showing up, Price Hill, et cetera. And at the top of the hills, they had these little resorts where they'd have alcohol and music and stuff like that, trying to entice people to come up there. So streetcar companies did a lot of things. They did that. They bought the zoo. They bought Chester Park, all these different things, trying to entice people to use their streetcars. But as much as the inclines were popular with people, the streetcar companies, once we had cars, they could drive up hills. It kind of became unnecessary. It was more of a novelty. And for them, it was really just slowed down the process of having to slowly get the cars onto the track and off the track and things like that. And so they would close the lines down for repairs and not reopen them, just dismantle them. So the last one was Mount Adams, closed in 1948. There's always hope that they'll bring back, but frankly, they're kind of more of a novelty than a real way of getting. But the ones in Pittsburgh are still up. Courthouse Riot in 1884. Well, it's kind of the thing about the timeline. You see, at the same time that we're building like the art museum and music hall and stuff, we still had this violence and stuff in the city, and people were tired of all the murders. And when there's one guy was given kind of a light sentence for murder, people got incensed and they went to they went to music hall and then marched to the jail to lynch him. But the guy had been moved out already, and while they were kind of going up against the police, the crowd instead went to the courthouse and they burned it down. If you see carefully in this picture, through the windows, you can see it's actually gutted in there. This is after the fire that had burned down the courthouse, which is the same place where the courthouse is today. And so they brought in the National Guard, and they had a Gatling gun, and they ended up firing into the crowd. After 3 days of rioting, there were 50 people dead, and the courthouse and all of those records and things were all destroyed. So it's one of those deadliest riots in American history, and it happened at the same time that we're in that kind of Queen City period. And then quick on subway, because I know that's a favorite topic for some people. We used to have a canal system that went from Lake Erie to Ohio River, and it followed what we now know as Central Parkway. And it was great for its time in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. But when railroads came, there was no need to have water to transport things. You can actually have the rails. And we kind of missed out on that. And a lot of the rails end up going to Chicago instead. But the canal lasted for a long time, but it wasn't used all that much for the canal boats. And it kind of became a nasty, bad septic water. So they wanted to get rid of it and put a nice parkway, Central Parkway. And in Europe, they had all these subways underneath. So the idea was to put one underneath. World War I broke out, and so they had to stop construction. When the war was over, cost of everything had gone up, but the city, the citizens didn't want to vote for more money for the project. So they started it finally in, oops, I went the wrong way, in 1920. And they had these two tracks that would go under Central Parkway, but a lot of politics got involved. There was a guy named Boss Cox who was kind of the leader of the political machine, a lot of corruption and stuff going on in politics. And when the progressive Charter Party, if you heard the Charterites that we still have, when they came out as a reaction to Boss Cox corruption, they came in and said, those projects that you were working on, we're going to stop those. And so they stopped construction of the subway after about 7 years, and 2.5 miles of track was built, but it was never used. And those tracks are still under Central Parkway. Last thing, 100 years ago, we had, very familiar to us now, we had the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic. History repeats itself. We used to have so many saloons and things in this area with all the German breweries in Cincinnati. You can see here a Wienerwurst with each drink. This is actually about where Carew Tower is now. We used to call it the Nasty Corner, about all the different things. We had something like one saloon for every 40 adult males in Cincinnati. Now, it was that many saloons. And just kind of show you, this is very, very quick. Other things happening over the last 100 years. You got Union Terminal, you got the 37 flood, King Records, James Brown, Ruth Lyons, the Cincinnati Royals and Oscar Robertson, the Beatles at Crosley Field, Kings Island, there's the Beast, Big Red Machine, Beverly Hills Supper Club, the Freezer Bowl, the Bengals going to their first Super Bowl, racial unrest, and Fiona. So that's kind of a quick hit of, I said it's 250 years of history is hard to cover in a short time, but it kind of gives you an idea of the story. So in the book, there's, images and about, a few hundred words on each of these topics, kind of showing their context. And it was, it was a lot of fun. Sometimes the more recent things were harder to try to figure out what people will consider to be important, 50 years from now. Some of the older stuff are obvious, and some of them, there are things like the floods and things that you have to include. But I'm hoping that Fiona is still talked about 50 years. So, Krista, I don't know if you want to open up if anyone has any questions, or I don't see anything in the comments at the moment.
Yeah, I don't see any questions right now, but if you guys have questions, feel free to pop them into the comments, and we would be happy to answer them.
Krista, do you have any questions?
I don't. I don't see any here. That's what I'm.
Well, I mean, do you have yourself?
Oh, oh gosh.
Put you on the spot.
I know, right?
Well, I will say this. So the book came out this summer, and it's available in all the local bookstores. You can also get it from me at www.jeffsuess.com. But I did a signing at Roebling Point there in Kentucky. They have it. I've also signed copies at most of the stores. So, I know I get the social distancing. It's difficult, but I'm trying to make it as available as possible for folks. It is a hefty book. They run about $40, but it's also, it's about 4 pounds. I was surprised how big the book ended up being in the end. Like I said, if you order from me, I can also personalize signatures and things like that. But I'm happy anyway to do it. Or if you do get a copy and you want to contact me through my website, I'd be happy to meet up with folks and personalize it and things like that.
And it is a fantastic book. I can attest to that. I looked at it earlier this week again. And we do have a copy here at the library. If you want to come in and take a browse at it before you buy it. And I should say, we were planning on having Mr. Suess at the library back in, June?
Yeah.
We were going to do a visit, and we were going to have his books, here for you to look at and available for purchase. And of course, things happened in the world. So hopefully we can have you in the near future and have a real author visit.
Happy to do it. Yeah, no, it's a great library. I've been there,
Thank
using
you.
it for many years, all the different branches, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with folks. I love just talking about Cincinnati history. As you see, I kind of internalize these stories and just love sharing them. So if anybody reach out to me, have any questions later. Again, I'm at the Inquirer, so you can find me there. You can find me through the website, jeffsuess.com, or I'm sure Krista can find a way to contact me if you have any questions.
Yes. And if you missed his contact information, but you're seeing this on our website maybe later on, maybe you're watching the replay, you can always contact us at our department. Our phone is 859-962-4070. You could also email us history@kentonlibrary.org. And if you have a question for Mr. Suess, we can get you in contact with him.
Well, I look forward to eventually getting to see some of you folks when I can be there in person. And I thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and presenting today and telling us about your book. We appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
All right. If you guys don't have any questions, we will go ahead and sign off. But thank you for tuning in. We do appreciate it. And like I said, join us in a couple weeks on August 21st, and we'll be back talking about our Faces and Places collection. So hope you guys all take care. Thank you for tuning in.
Bye.